They said a princess who could not speak would never wear a queen's crown. By my 24th birthday, 17 noblemen had politely rejected my hand. Some smiled with pity. Others refused to meet my eyes entirely. One lord, the third one, had actually brought his own physician to the meeting as though my silence were a contagion he needed protecting from. My father had sat across from each of them with the composed dignity of a king and the quietly breaking heart of a father, and I had watched the cracks deepen with every rejection until the man who had once commanded armies began to look like someone who had run out of battles he knew how to fight. He never said it was my fault. He never once looked at me the way the nobleman did. But love does not always protect the people it is directed at from the damage done by watching them suffer, and I had spent 9 years watching my father suffer for a silence I could have broken at any moment. I had not broken it, because the man who killed my mother had looked at me across her body when I was 15 years old and said, with the particular calm of someone who meant exactly what they were saying, that if I ever told anyone what I'd seen, my father would not live to hear it. I had believed him. I still believed him. So I stayed silent, and my father's heart developed cracks, and 17 men looked at me with pity or disgust until he quietly arranged for me to be married to Lord Fenwick of the Minor Territories, a man no royal family respected, because a minor lord was better than a daughter who remained unmarried at 24, which was its own kind of statement about her worth. I had accepted it. I had made peace with the story my life was going to tell. Then the palace trumpets announced the arrival of Crown Prince Lucian of Asterion. If you are new here, welcome to Emerald Novel. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Now let's get back to our princess, because trust me, this trumpet announcement is only the beginning. The trumpets were not meant for me. That was the first thing I understood when I heard them from the window of my sitting room, where I had been reviewing the marriage contract my father's advisors had prepared for Lord Fenwick. The contract used careful diplomatic language to describe me, phrases like limited verbal communication and alternative methods of expression, which were the written version of the pity smile the nobleman had given me in person. I had been reading it with the detached attention of someone processing a document about a life they had already accepted rather than one they were still fighting for. The trumpets changed the quality of the morning immediately. An unannounced royal visit to a kingdom our size meant either crisis or deliberate theater, and the Asterion standard visible from my window, gold and deep blue snapping in the morning wind, belonged to the wealthiest kingdom in the region. Crown Prince Lucian of Asterion did not make unannounced visits to minor kingdoms without a reason significant enough to justify the journey. I set down the marriage contract and went to the window. The procession entering our gates was not large. 20 riders, perhaps, traveling light in the manner of people who had moved fast rather than impressively. Lucian rode at the center, and I recognized him from the portraits that circulated in diplomatic correspondence, dark-haired and composed, younger-looking in person than official portraiture suggested, with the particular posture of someone who rode as naturally as walking. He looked up at the palace as he entered the gates. For one moment, across the distance of 2 floors and a courtyard, his eyes found my window. He did not look away immediately, the way people usually looked away from me when they realized I was watching them. He held the look for a breath, something moving across his expression that I couldn't read at the distance, and then he rode on. I stepped back from the window. My lady's maid Cora appeared in the doorway behind me with the expression she wore when she had information she was barely containing. "He's here to see the king," she said. "But the chamberlain is saying—" She stopped herself. I looked at her and raised an eyebrow, which was one of the 17 nonverbal communications I had refined across 9 years of silence into something precise enough to carry full sentences. Cora understood this one as well as all the others. "The chamberlain is saying he came to ask for your hand," she said, in the tone of someone delivering news they found simultaneously thrilling and impossible. I looked back at the window. The courtyard was empty now. The procession had moved inside. I thought about 17 noblemen with pity smiles, about a marriage contract that described me in diplomatic euphemisms, about a minor lord no royal family respected who was waiting somewhere in the minor territories to receive a princess as a consolation prize. Then I thought about a crown prince who had crossed 3 kingdoms on a fast horse with 20 riders and no advance notice. People did not do that for nothing. People especially did not do that for a princess every nobleman in the region had already declined, which meant he knew something, or wanted something, or was something other than what the situation appeared to be on its surface. I had spent 9 years reading situations from silence because silence made you pay attention in ways that speaking never required. I reached for the marriage contract on the table and folded it precisely and placed it in the drawer of my writing desk. Not destroyed. Not signed. Simply set aside until I understood what this morning actually was. My father sent for me an hour after Lucien's arrival. The walk from my sitting room to the great receiving hall was long enough to observe 3 separate conversations that stopped when I passed and resumed when I moved far enough away. The palace had already absorbed the news and was processing it in the way palaces processed unexpected things, through whisper and speculation and the particular energy of people who understood that something significant was happening without yet knowing its full shape. I walked through it with the composure I had spent 9 years building, which looked like calm and functioned like armor. The receiving hall had been arranged for a formal meeting, which meant my father had been given enough notice to prepare even if the visit itself was technically unannounced. He sat in the primary chair with his senior advisor Lord Pemwick beside him, and the particular expression he wore when he was managing his own surprise while presenting something else to the room. Crown Prince Lucien stood when I entered, not the half-rise that courtesy required. Fully upright, turning to face the door, with the complete attention of someone who had been waiting specifically for this moment. The movement was natural rather than performed, which made it more significant rather than less. I stopped at appropriate distance from the seated arrangement and inclined my head in the correct greeting for a crown prince of equivalent standing. He inclined his in return, slightly deeper than protocol required. My father spoke. Seraphine. Crown Prince Lucien of Asterion has expressed a desire to be introduced formally. He has stated his purpose to me, and I have agreed that you should hear it directly from him. I looked at Lucien. He looked at me. Princess Seraphine, he said, with the particular care of someone who had decided exactly how they were going to say something before they said it. I will not perform the introduction I prepared on the road here, because now that I am standing in this room, I think it would not suit you. So, I will simply say this.
He paused.
I came to ask for your hand. I came because I have thought about doing so for a long time. And I came without sending advance notice because I did not want you to spend weeks preparing for my arrival. I thought it more respectful to simply appear and let you form an opinion of me in real circumstances rather than staged ones. The room was quiet. I reached for the small writing board I carried everywhere, the flat slate and chalk that served as my voice in rooms where gestures alone were insufficient, and I wrote one word and turned it toward him.
Why?
He read it. Because 7 years ago, I passed through the border town of Kalen on a diplomatic journey, he said. I was traveling without my full retinue, riding ahead of my party to make better time. My horse threw a shoe on the eastern road, and I walked him to the nearest village. A girl was sitting outside the smithy reading. She looked up when I arrived. She assessed my horse's leg before I asked her to. She pointed to the smithy door and then to a bucket of cold water near the fence and then to the horse's leg, in that precise order, and I understood every instruction immediately and did exactly what she indicated. He paused. She was correct. The leg was beginning to swell, and the cold water reduced it before it could worsen. She saved the horse significant suffering through 3 gestures and no words. He looked at me steadily. I asked the smith afterward who she was, he said. He told me she was a princess traveling with a reduced guard, passing through on a quiet journey. He told me she did not speak. A pause. He said it like it was the most important thing about her. I thought it was the least. I stood in the receiving hall of my father's palace holding a writing slate with one word on it and felt something shift in the careful architecture of 9 years of managed distance from every person who had ever looked at me and seen primarily what was missing. My father made a sound that was not quite words. Lord Pemwick looked at his hands. I wrote a second word beneath the first and turned it toward Lucien. You remembered. Yes, he said simply. I remembered. My father gave us the East Garden for the afternoon. It was his version of careful optimism, choosing the garden that my mother had planted and that he had maintained unchanged for 9 years as the place where his daughter would spend time with the man who had, in 20 minutes in the receiving hall, done something 17 noblemen across 3 years had failed to do. Made me feel like the silence was mine rather than a deficit. Cora followed at the appropriate distance that gave privacy without abandoning propriety. Lucien walked beside me on the garden path with his hands clasped behind his back and the unhurried manner of someone who had not come here to fill silence with sound. Most people who spent time with me felt the silence as pressure. They talked to compensate for it, offering words in the space where mine would have gone, which was kind in intention and exhausting in practice. 9 years of people talking at me to cover what they found uncomfortable about my quiet had made me very good at appearing to listen while actually observing. Lucien did not talk to cover anything. He walked and occasionally noted something in the garden with the observational quality of someone who found the world genuinely interesting: a climbing rose that had overtaken its trellis, a stone bench worn smooth at the center from years of use, and he made these observations the way you make them to someone who is present rather than someone who needs to be included. After a while I wrote on my slate and showed him. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked. I wrote, "Someone performing consideration. The way noblemen perform it when they want something." He read it and looked at the garden path. "I want something," he said honestly. "I want you to agree to the marriage. That is not a performance, it is a goal. But the consideration is real."
He paused.
"There is a difference between wanting something and being willing to be dishonest about how you pursue it." I wrote, "Most people don't make that distinction. Most people find honesty inconvenient," he said. "I find dishonesty exhausting. It requires remembering too many versions of things." I looked at him sideways. He glanced at me, and something in his expression was briefly unguarded in the way that expressions become when a person has said something true without intending to reveal quite how true it was. I wrote, "Why did it take you 7 years?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was 20 when I saw you in Kalen," he said. "I was not yet in a position to make a proposal that would be taken seriously by your father's court. By the time I had heard about the rejections. 17 of them. I was advised that pursuing a princess who had been declined by 17 men would reflect poorly on Asterian's judgment."
He paused.
"I disagreed with that advice for 2 years before I finally ignored it." I stopped walking. He stopped beside me. I wrote slowly, making sure of each word before I showed it. 17 men looked at me and saw a problem. "You looked at me and saw someone give instructions about a horse." "Yes," he said. I wrote, "That is either very simple or very complicated."
"Both," he said.
"In my experience, the true things usually are." We stood in my mother's garden in the afternoon light, and I thought about a minor lord in the territories waiting to receive a consolation princess, and about a marriage contract in a drawer describing me in diplomatic euphemisms, and about the specific sensation of being seen by someone who is not looking for what was missing. I wrote one more thing and showed it to him. "I will give you an answer in 3 days. I need to understand something first." "What do you need to understand?" he asked. I wrote, "Whether you know something about my silence that you haven't told me yet." He looked at the slate for a long moment. Then he looked at me with an expression that answered the question before his words did. "Yes," he said quietly, "there is something. And I think it is time I told you what it is." We sat on the stone bench worn smooth at its center, and Lucien told me what he knew. 7 years ago, riding ahead of his party on the Eastern Road, he had stopped in Kalen not only because of a horse. He had been traveling under a reduced retinue deliberately, gathering information his official diplomatic channels could not collect, which was something crown princes of wealthy kingdoms occasionally did when the situation required understanding that formal visits did not produce. He had been in Kalen because of a man named Dreist, who was known in certain circles as a facilitator, someone who arranged things for people who needed things arranged without official record. Dreist had been seen in the border regions twice in the months before Lucien's passage through, and Lucien's intelligence network had flagged the movement as potentially relevant to Asterian's interests, without yet understanding why. "I met Dreist briefly in Kalen," Lucien said. "He did not know who I was. I was traveling as a minor trade official. We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes over wine in the village inn. He mentioned, in the way people mention things when they are drinking and believe they are speaking to someone inconsequential, that he had recently completed a significant piece of work in a neighboring kingdom." He paused. He described it as silencing something that had become inconvenient. I was very still on the bench. "I did not understand the reference at the time," Lucien said. "It was only later, when I began making inquiries about your kingdom and heard that your mother the queen had died and that her daughter had stopped speaking at the same time, that I began to understand what he might have meant." I reached for my slate with hands that were not quite steady. "You think Dreist killed my mother?" I think Dreist was contracted to kill her, Lucian said carefully. I think whoever contracted him also instructed him to ensure the silence of any witness. And I think the witness was you. My chalk sat against the slate, without moving. You don't have to write anything, he said. You don't have to confirm anything. I am not asking you to. I looked at the garden, at the roses my mother had planted and my father had maintained for 9 years because letting them go would have been its own kind of surrender. I wrote, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked if I knew something I hadn't told you," he said. And I said yes. And I am not willing to pursue a marriage with someone while holding information that belongs to them.
He paused.
Whatever you witnessed 9 years ago is yours. The silence it created is yours. I have no claim on either. I only wanted you to know that I have been trying to find Dreist for 2 years, through channels that do not appear in official correspondence, because what he does to people and what was done to you and to your mother should not continue to go unanswered. I sat in my mother's garden with the afternoon going gold around us, and looked at the man who had crossed 3 kingdoms to ask for my hand and understood, sitting beside him on a bench worn smooth by years of use, that he had not crossed 3 kingdoms only for a girl who had given correct instructions about a horse. He had crossed 3 kingdoms because he had spent 7 years understanding what had been done to her and deciding what to do about it. I wrote, "Have you found him?" Lucian looked at the garden. 3 weeks ago, he said quietly, my people located Dreist in a port city 2 days' ride from Asterian's eastern border. He paused. He is currently being held in a location I will not describe here. He has not yet been questioned formally. I looked at him. He looked at me. "I wanted to speak with you first," he said, "before anything else happened, because the questions I need to ask him are not mine to ask. They are yours." I set the chalk down on the slate and sat with the weight of what he had just handed me, understanding that the silence I had chosen at 15 to protect my father had not been the end of my mother's story. It had only been the pause before someone finally decided to finish it properly. I went to my father that evening. Not with the full truth. Not yet. I was not ready to dismantle 9 years of silence in a single evening, and I understood enough about the situation Lucian had described to know that moving carefully was more important than moving immediately. What I brought my father was a question, written on my slate in the careful script I had used for 9 years to say the things I needed said. Asked him to tell me everything he remembered about the night my mother died. He looked at the slate for a long time without speaking. Then he did something I had not seen from him in years. He set aside the composed dignity of a king and became simply a man sitting in a chair in his private study, older than he should have been for his years, carrying something heavy in the way that people carry things when they have carried them alone for too long. He told me, my mother had been killed in the east corridor of the palace, between her private chambers and the library, where she often worked in the evenings. The official record listed an unknown intruder. The investigation had produced no confirmed suspect. The case remained technically open and practically closed, the way cases closed when the people responsible for solving them encountered obstacles they couldn't explain, and eventually stopped trying. I wrote, "Was there evidence that was not pursued?"
My father looked at me.
"Why are you asking this tonight?" he said. I wrote, "Because someone may have found something." He was very still for a moment. "Who?" he asked. I wrote, "Someone I think I trust. But I need to know what you know first." He looked at his hands and then at the window, and then at me with the expression of a father who had spent 9 years watching his daughter carry something in silence and had been too afraid of what the weight of it was to ask directly. "There was a witness report," he said, "from a palace guard who was near the east corridor that evening. He reported seeing a man he did not recognize moving quickly toward the servants' exit shortly after the time of death. He gave a description."
He paused.
The description disappeared from the official investigation record within a week. I only know it existed because the guard came to me privately 3 months later to ask why his report had been removed. I had no answer for him. I wrote, "What happened to the guard?" "He requested a transfer to the outer territories," my father said. "He left within the month. I have not heard from him since." Someone had removed a witness report. Someone inside the palace, with access to the investigation records, had protected whoever had been in that corridor. I wrote one final question and showed it to my father, who managed the investigation. My father's expression moved through several things before it settled. "Lord Pemwick," he said. He was my senior advisor then, as he is now. He volunteered to oversee it personally. I was grieving. I was grateful. "Lord Pemwick." who had sat beside my father in the receiving hall that morning, who had looked at his hands when Lucien finished speaking. I kept my expression exactly as it had been and wrote, "Thank you. Please don't mention this conversation to anyone yet." My father looked at me for a long moment with the eyes of a man who was beginning to understand that his silent daughter had been carrying something considerably larger than grief. "Seraphine," he said softly. I shook my head gently, and he stopped. I left his study and walked back to my rooms through the palace corridors, past the east corridor where my mother had died, moving through it with the composed invisibility I had maintained for 9 years. Lord Pemwick had managed the investigation. Lord Pemwick had removed the witness report. Lord Pemwick had been seated in the receiving hall this morning when Lucien of Asterion, who was holding Dreist in a location 2 days from his eastern border, had walked in and asked for my hand. And Lord Pemwick had looked at his hands. I sent a message to Lucien that evening through Cora, who carried notes with the discretion of someone who had served me for 9 years and understood that discretion was the most valuable thing she offered. The message was brief. Lord Pemwick managed my mother's investigation. A witness report was removed. The witness transferred to the Outer Territories 9 years ago. I need to know if Dreist will give us the name of who contracted him before Pemwick understands why you are here. Lucien's response arrived within the hour.
He will.
We move tomorrow. I need one thing from you first. I read it and wrote back immediately.
What?
His response was 4 words. Tell me you're safe. I sat in my sitting room with the note in my hand and felt something move through me that had nothing to do with Dreist or Pemwick or 9 years of silence, and everything to do with 4 words from a man who, in the middle of dismantling a conspiracy, had stopped to ask about me specifically. I wrote back.
For tonight, yes.
Tomorrow depends on how fast we move. His response came faster than the previous ones. Then we move fast. The following morning, Lucien requested a formal meeting with my father under the pretense of discussing the marriage proposal's terms, which gave them 3 hours in the private study while Lord Pemwick, who would normally attend such a meeting as senior advisor, found himself politely excluded on the grounds that preliminary discussions between a prospective groom and the bride's father were traditionally private. Pemwick accepted this with the composed grace of a man who had no legitimate grounds to object. I watched his face when he accepted it. He was not surprised.
He was calculating.
I recognized the expression because I had spent 9 years in silence learning to read expressions more accurately than most people read words, and what I read on Pemwick's face in the corridor outside my father's study was not the mild disappointment of an advisor excluded from a meeting. It was a man deciding how much time he had. I went directly from the corridor to my sitting room and wrote a note and gave it to Cora with instructions to place it in Lucien's hands personally within the next 10 minutes. Pemwick knows something is wrong. He's calculating. Whatever you're moving tomorrow, move today.
Cora ran.
I sat at my writing desk and looked at the marriage contract still in the drawer, still folded precisely, still unsigned, and thought about a 15-year-old girl in an east corridor who had made a decision that cost her 9 years of silence to protect her father from the man who had just been excluded from a meeting and was currently calculating in a palace corridor. She had made the right decision with the information she had. I was about to make a different one with better information. I opened the drawer and took out the contract and read it one final time, all the diplomatic euphemisms and careful phrases, and then I set it aside and took a fresh piece of paper and began writing something that was not a marriage contract and not a note to Lucien, but something I had been composing in my head for 9 years without knowing I was doing it. A testimony. Everything I had seen in the East Corridor on the night my mother died, written in the careful script of someone who had spent 9 years making words on paper carry the full weight of everything she could not say out loud. I wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When I was finished, I sealed it and wrote my father's name on the outside and placed it in the drawer where the contract had been.
Not yet.
But ready. Because the moment was coming, I could feel it moving through the day the way you feel weather changing before the sky shows it, and when it arrived I intended to be the one who decided how it was met. Dreist talked before noon. Lucien's people had been thorough across 2 years of building the case, and a man who facilitates things for people who need things arranged without official record understands, when thorough people present him with the full documented weight of his facilitations, that the arithmetic of cooperation versus consequence is straightforward. He gave the name. Lucien came to find me himself rather than sending a note, which told me the name was significant enough that he wanted to be present when I received it. He found me in the East Garden, the same bench, the afternoon going golden the way it had the day before, and he sat beside me and said it without preamble because he understood that I was not someone who needed things softened before they were delivered. Lord Pemwick, he said. I had known since the corridor outside my father's study. Knowing and hearing confirmed were different things. I pressed both hands flat on my knees and breathed. Dreist has given a full testimony, Lucian said. He was contracted 9 years ago by Pemwick, who wanted your mother removed because she had discovered evidence of his financial arrangements with a foreign trade network that would have ended his position and his freedom. The contract included instructions to silence any witness permanently.
He paused.
He chose not to follow that instruction. He told Dreist instead to threaten the witness into silence. He said, Lucian stopped briefly. He said she was a child, and he drew a line at that. A man who facilitated assassinations drawing a line at threatening a 15-year-old girl. The world was full of moral distinctions that didn't hold up to examination. But his line had kept me alive. I picked up my slate. Lucian watched me write without rushing me. When I turned it toward him, it said, My father needs to know today. Before Pemwick realizes the testimony exists. Already moving, Lucian said. My people are with your father's guard captain now. Pemwick will be detained within the hour. He looked at me steadily. Your father is going to have questions that go beyond what I can answer for you. I looked at the slate in my hands. Then I set it down on the bench. The garden was very quiet in the late afternoon, just wind in the roses my mother had planted and birds in the upper branches of the old oak at the garden's edge, and the distant sounds of the palace going about its ordinary business, unaware that the shape of things was changing. I had spent 9 years finding ways to speak without speaking. Notes and slates and precise gestures and 17 calibrated expressions that Cora could read as accurately as words. I had built an entire language out of silence because silence had been the only protection I had for the thing I loved most, and the silence had worked. My father was alive. 9 years of silence, and he was alive. But Pemwick was about to be detained. And my father was about to hear testimony from a man named Dreist. And the 15-year-old girl who had stood in an east corridor and made the only decision available to her was 24 years old now, and the decision was no longer the only one available. I stood up from the bench. Lucian stood beside me. I looked at him, at the man who had remembered a girl in a village for 7 years and crossed 3 kingdoms and found the person responsible and sat on a worn stone bench and told me the truth without performing it, and I understood that the thing I was about to do I was going to do for my father and for my mother and for 9 years of a silence that had never been weakness, but had cost me everything it cost me regardless. And I understood that I wanted to do it with Lucian present, not for support, not because I needed holding up, because he had earned the right to be in the room when it happened. I wrote on the slate one final time and showed it to him.
Come with me.
He read it. Yes, he said, without hesitation. We walked through the east garden toward the palace doors, and I did not pick up the slate again because I did not need it for what came next. My father was in his study when we arrived, already aware from his guard captain that something significant was in motion, his face carrying the expression of a man bracing for information he had been waiting 9 years to receive and was not certain he was ready for. He looked at me when I came through the door. Then he looked at Lucian. Then he looked at me again. I stood in the center of his study in the late afternoon light, and I opened my mouth, and for the first time in 9 years, I let the silence end. My voice came out rough from disuse, quieter than it had been at 15, shaped differently by years of living only in my throat rather than in the air, but it was mine, and it was real, and it carried every word I needed it to carry.
Papa, I said.
My father made a sound I had never heard from him before and would never forget. There is something I have to tell you, I said, about the night Mama died, about what I saw, about why I stopped speaking. I paused and felt Lucian behind me, present and steady and not touching me because I didn't need holding up. I need you to listen to everything before you say anything.
Can you do that?
My father pressed both hands over his mouth and nodded. I told him, all of it in my own voice, rough and quiet and entirely mine, everything I had written in the testimony in the drawer and more, the east corridor and the man and the threat and the 15 years old and the 9 years of silence and the reason for every single day of it. I talked for a long time. My father listened to every word. Pemwick confessed 3 days after his detention. Not immediately. Not without his own calculations about the arithmetic of his situation. But Drea's testimony combined with the financial records Lucian's people had assembled across 2 years of thorough work left him very little room to construct an alternative account, and a man who had spent 9 years believing his secret was perfectly contained eventually runs out of the energy required to maintain that belief against the weight of documented evidence. He confessed to contracting Dreist. He confessed to removing the witness report from the investigation record. He confessed to the financial arrangements with a foreign trade network that had made my mother's discovery a threat he believed he had no other way to manage. He did not confess to remorse, which told me more about him than the confession did. My father sat through the testimony with the particular stillness of a man absorbing something that was simultaneously devastating and clarifying, the specific quality of grief that arrives when you finally understand the shape of a loss you have been living inside without being able to name. Afterward, he came to find me in the East Garden. He sat beside me on the stone bench and did not speak for a long time, and I sat beside him and did not speak either, which was different now from the silence I had maintained for 9 years, a chosen quiet rather than a protected one, 2 people sitting with something large and not rushing to cover it with words. She would be furious, he said finally. Your mother, that you carried this alone for 9 years. She would understand why, I said. My voice was less rough than it had been in the study 3 days ago, returning to itself with the gradual ease of something that had been waiting rather than lost. Yes, he said. She would understand. And then she would be furious anyway. He looked at the roses. She was like that. Understanding and furious simultaneously. It was one of her best qualities. I looked at the roses too. Tell me about her, I said. Things I don't know. Things from before I was old enough to remember. My father looked at me sideways with the expression that had been arriving on his face with increasing frequency in the past 3 days, the one that was still learning how to hold the fact of my voice alongside everything it had cost to hear it again. He told me about her for a long time, sitting in the garden she had planted, while the afternoon moved around them in its ordinary way, indifferent to the specific weight of what was being said inside it, and therefore, paradoxically, exactly the right setting for it. Lucian came to find us as the light was going golden. He stopped at the edge of the garden path when he saw us together and made to withdraw, which was the correct instinct and the wrong decision. Stay, my father said, without turning around. Lucian came and sat on the bench beside me, and the 3 of us sat in the garden for a while without anyone needing to fill the quiet. Eventually my father stood. The marriage contract, he said to Lucian. The one my advisors prepared. Burn it. Lucian looked at him. We will prepare a new one, my father said. One that does not describe my daughter in diplomatic euphemisms. He looked at me. One that describes her accurately. Which is how? Lucian asked. My father looked at me with the expression he had worn when I walked through a study door and opened my mouth and said, Papa, the expression that had not entirely settled in 3 days because some things took longer than 3 days to accommodate. Capable, he said. Observant. Brave in a way that most people who have never needed to be brave cannot recognize as bravery. He paused. And currently in possession of a voice that she is going to use whenever she chooses, for whatever she chooses, and anyone who has a difficulty with that can find themselves a different kingdom to live in. He walked back toward the palace without waiting for a response, which was his version of an exit, and which landed with the particular weight of a father who had spent 9 years with cracks in his heart finally beginning to understand what had been holding it together. I watched him go. Lucian sat beside me in the quiet of the garden. He's remarkable, he said. Yes, I said. He is. We sat for a moment in the way we had learned to sit together across 4 days of garden benches and honest conversations and information delivered without softening. The new contract, Lucian said. When your father's advisors prepare it, I want you to read every word before it is signed. If anything in it doesn't suit you, it comes out. I know, I said. I want to be sure you know, he said. I looked at him sideways. Lucian, I said. I spent 9 years communicating everything I needed to communicate without a single word. I think I can manage reading a contract. He looked at me with the expression that arrived on his face when I had said something that caught him unprepared for it, the brief, unguarded quality that was becoming my favorite version of his face. Yes, he said. I imagine you can. The garden went on doing what gardens do in the late afternoon, growing and leaning toward the remaining light with the patient consistency of things that understood that what they were doing was exactly enough. I sat in the garden my mother had planted and felt the silence around me the way I had always felt it, as mine, shaped by my own choices, belonging to no one's fear and no one's threat and no one's diplomatic euphemism. The difference was that now I could end it whenever I chose. And I chose, sitting on a worn stone bench in the late afternoon with a man who had remembered me for 7 years and crossed 3 kingdoms and never once asked me to be anything other than what I was, to say one more thing. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. Because 9 years of silence had taught me that words, when you finally use them, should be the ones that mattered. "Thank you," I said, "for coming." Lucien looked at the garden. "Thank you," he said, "for the horse." I laughed. It came out rough and quiet and entirely real, and it startled a bird from the upper branches of the old oak at the garden's edge, and it filled the space my mother's roses grew in with something that had not been there in 9 years.
Sound. Meaning. Free.
And that is the story of a princess who is never truly silent, only waiting for the world to be safe enough to speak again. If this story stayed with you today, hit the like button before you go and leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from and the moment that hit you hardest. Subscribe if you haven't already and share this with someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who protected everyone she loved with nothing but silence and sheer quiet courage. I will see you in the next one. Don't go too far.